Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more Executive Branch. Before we get into today's video, I do want to go ahead and remind you I've got two ways to donate to the channel. I have a Patreon account, which is a month-to-month donation system. Monthly donations come out monthly. I have a coffee account, which can do much the same, but also allows you to donate one single donation at lower amounts. So, yeah. Do not donate if you are in financial trouble, or if donating will put you in financial trouble. It's hard enough for everybody out there. I'd rather you be able to take care of what you need to take care of. If you can afford to donate and you want to donate, thank you. I do appreciate it. I really do. It's me, myself, and I that make these videos. So, yeah. With that said, let's jump into the video. Today, we are looking at that cabinet. James Madison's cabinet. We're going to look at his vice presidents and his Secretary of States. First Vice President, George Clinton, not of the Parliament Funkadelic. This is a different George Clinton. And clearly he has a history in politics. He was the uncle of George Clinton Jr., uncle of DeWitt Clinton, uncle of James Graham Clinton. But yeah, George Clinton, first vice president for James Madison. He was also a delegate from New York. There they talk about him being vice president of the U.S. Was studied law, was and admitted to the bar to practice law, clerk of the Court of Common Pleas, district attorney, surveyor. Also was apparently had some military service. So yeah. Member of the New York 1768, served on the New York Committee of Correspondence in 1774, a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. I think the New York Committee of Correspondence was dealing with setting up New York as a state, and the Second Continental Congress was the national attempts that were being made to try to make a national federal government. Was a brigadier general of the militia, serving in the Revolutionary War, appointed brigadier general, governor of New York, president of New York State Convention, which ratified its federal constitution, governor of New York, again, after the federal constitution had been ratified, elected Vice President of the United States, serving 4 years under Thomas Jefferson, and then re-elected in 1908 and served under James Madison until he died in office, April 20th, 1812. So he first served under Jefferson and continued service under Madison. But yeah, we saw he's got some relatives that were also in politics in the early days. George Clinton Jr., him himself a representative from New York, delegate to the state convention in 1801, member of the state assembly 1804 to 1805. Elected to the 8th and 9th Congress to fill vacancies caused by the resignation of Samuel L. Mitchell, and re-elected to the 10th Congress and served from February 1805 to March 1809, dying in New York City in 1809. So he died relatively young, especially compared to his father. Well, it said it was his uncle. Maybe his father was George Clinton as well. Interesting. But yeah, here's Clinton, DeWitt Clinton. He's got a bit of fame on his own. Senator from New York. Went and studied law at Columbia College, now Columbia University. Admitted to the bar. Practiced in New York City. Private secretary to the governor. Member of the state assembly. Member of the state senate. Delegate to the state constitutional convention. Member of the council of appointments, and elected to the U.S. Senate to fill vacancies caused by resignation of John Armstrong, serving from 1802 to 1803, when he himself resigned. Was mayor of the city of New York, and organized the Historical Society of New York while mayor. Becoming its president. Also organized the Academy of Fine Arts. Was lieutenant governor of New York. Unsuccessful candidate for the Peace Party for president of the United States in 1812. Regent for the University of New York. Member of the commission to explore a route for a canal between Lake Erie and Lake Hudson. And the Hudson River, Lake Erie and the Hudson River. Broke ground for that canal while governor, and served several years as canal commissioner. So yeah. And then we also have James Graham Clinton. Representative from New York. Studied law. Admitted to the bar. Practiced. Master of Chancery of Orange County. Judge of the Court of Common Pleas of Orange County. Director of the Newburgh Whaling Company and the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Project. Colonel of the State Militia. Elected as a Democrat to the 27th and 28th Congresses. Chairman of the Committee in Expenditures. Was not a candidate for re-election in 1844. Died in New York City in 1849. But yeah, all of them, because they're related to George Clinton, who was Madison's first vice president. A closer look at Clinton himself. Born July the 26th, 1739 in Little Britain, New York, and died April 20th, 1812 in Washington, D.C., and was the 4th vice president. served in the administrations of Jefferson and Madison as vice president. Was the son of Charles Clinton, a farmer and surveyor, and Elizabeth Denniston. He served in the last French and Indian War, or as it's, I think, as known in Britain, the 8 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Is it 8 years or 7 years? Something like that. It's known as French and Indian in the U.S. And was a member of the New York Assembly, 1768 to 1775. And the Continental Congress. In the summer of 1776, before he could sign the Declaration, he was ordered by General George Washington to New York City, and would, in March of 1777, would be appointed Brigadier General. So yeah, remember, even though he was in all these committees and conferences trying to set up the new government, he was also part of the revolutionary militia and military. Immensely popular with the people of New York, he was elected governor in 1777, serving 21 years, 1777 to 1795, and 1801 to 1804. Remember, I think the Constitution was brought into they decided to write the Constitution in 1789. I may be off on what I'm thinking here, but anyway, he was a forceful leader and able administrator. Fearful of threats to his political power in New York, he argued against ratification of the U.S. Constitution, maintaining that the power granted to the national government to regulate commerce would undermine New York's commercial advantages, such as being near waterways and ports. So yeah. In national politics, he was a follower of Jefferson and was elected as his vice president in 1804. After an unsuccessful attempt to win nomination for president in 1808, he was re-elected vice president under Madison. He died before the expiration of his second term, and was the first vice president to die in office, George Clinton. Now, we look at this. He's under Jefferson, gets reelected, serves under Madison, 1809 to 1812, but dies in office. And so from 1812 to 1813, there is no vice president. But with the next term, the election of 1812, in which we elect the next presidential setup, Madison is again elected president, and this time we get Elbridge Gerry elected vice president. And he is the one who the word gerrymander is named after. I think it's supposed to be technically Elbridge Gerry is how it's supposed to be pronounced, but yeah. Born July the 17th, 1744 in Marblehead, Massachusetts. He died November 23rd, 1814 in Washington, D.C. Was a signer of the American Declaration of Independence and the 5th Vice President of the United States. And in the second term of President James, and was vice president under the second term of James Madison. From his name, the term gerrymander was later derived, because he was the one who's like, well, let's draw these districts like this instead of making common sense districts. He was the son of Thomas Gary, a merchant, and Elizabeth Greenleaf. He graduated from Harvard College, later Harvard University, in 1762 and entered his father's business. He was a member of the Massachusetts Legislature and General Court, served on the Committee of Correspondence, was a member of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and was a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So, very, very strong influence in early American politics before we even have our Declaration. Because, as you remember it saying, he was one of the original signers of the Declaration. Let's see. He was also a member of Congress 1783 to 1785 under the Articles of Confederation, and a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and was an outspoken opponent of ratification of the U.S. Constitution, fearing it might give way to aristocratic and monarchical rule. Remember, we've spoken about this before. Early on, with the Articles of Confederation, they wanted to make sure the states had the power and that there was almost a weak to non-existent federal government. But trying to collect taxes to pay a national military and other things proved to be kind of difficult when each state would print their own version of money, would pay out at their own times. And so there was no real uniformity, and it made things very difficult to do on a national level, because they had just gained freedom from Britain. And so, yeah, they were very much anti-monarchy, anti-centralized power. So you can understand why there was a push against the Constitution by some. But it was something that needed to happen. There needed to be a central government. But even today, you can kind of see why they feared having a central government, because you could have evil shits like we got in the executive position right now. However, he gave it his full support after its ratification, helping to draft the Bill of Rights, and serving as a representative in Congress for 2 terms. Yeah, see, there's supposed to be a Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution that are along with the given rights and laws within the text of the articles themselves. Even though, like I said, the pedophile and president, the con man in chief, don't care about people's rights. He's just about serving himself and his little buddies. Which is, again, why there was such fear of a centralized power, because you could have jackasses who are greedy and hateful like him being in power. In 1797, President John Adams and John Marshall, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney were sent to France on a mission that resulted in the XYZ affair, which, yeah, one of the big scandals of the Adams presidency. The mission, an unsuccessful attempt to negotiate a treaty to settle several long-standing disputes, ended early because of the duplicitous treatment of the American negotiators by the French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand and his subordinates. After the French agents demanded bribes, Marshall and Pinckney departed in disgust. However, Gary remained in Paris in a vain hope that Talleyrand might offer him, a known friend of France, terms that had been refused to Marshall and Pinckney. The action brought a storm of abuse and censure from Federalist partisans, from which Gary never fully cleared himself. So, still looking and hoping that there might be a treaty, he kind of paid a political price for that. After 4 attempts to win election as governor of Massachusetts, he succeeded in 1810 and was reelected in 1811. His administration was notable for its rise in what became known as gerrymandering, the division of electoral districts for partisan political advantage. In 1812, Gary, an ardent supporter of war with Great Britain in the War of 1812, was elected Vice President of the United States on the Jeffersonian Republican ticket, with Madison. In 1813, while presiding over the Senate, he who, along with Madison, was in ill health, refused to yield his chair at the close of the legislative session, thus preventing William Giles, a senator from Virginia and an advocate of peace with Britain, from being president pro tempore of the Senate and thereby second in line after the vice president to succeed the president under the Presidential Succession Act of 1792. Gary suffered a hemorrhage of the lungs on his way to the Senate and died in 1814. So he also would die in office, much like his predecessor, Clinton. So yeah. After Elbridge Gerry would pass, there would not be another elected vice president or another appointed that I'm aware of. Now, let's go ahead and look at the 2 Secretary of States. Before we do, though, I'm going to take care of something right quick. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Went to go grab my bowl of oatmeal that had been in the microwave beeping at me for a while. And it took me a moment because my hip and leg had gone numb walking, so. Anyway. Now, as we were saying, Secretaries of State. First, we have Robert Smith. There's an image of him. Born November the 3rd, 1757 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and died November the 26th, 1842 in Baltimore, Maryland. Was U.S. Secretary of State under Madison. Grew up in Baltimore and graduated in 1781 from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. Studied law and became a prominent and prosperous Baltimore attorney. From 1793 to 1801, he was active in Maryland politics, serving in both state Senate and House of Delegates, and in the Baltimore City Council. Following Jefferson's election to the presidency, he was appointed Secretary of the Navy, largely owing to the influence of his brother. During the Jefferson administrations, he successfully prosecuted the naval war against the Barbary states and was conscientiously enforced Jefferson's embargo despite his personal opposition to the policy. It was during those years, however, that Smith and Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury, became foes. When Madison became president, he wanted Gallatin to be Secretary of State, but Samuel Smith and other prominent senators opposed Gallatin, and Robert Smith ultimately gained the post. Smith and Madison frequently disagreed, Smith objecting to the president's commercial restrictions. Madison unable to tolerate Smith's incoherent diplomatic communications. In 1811, in a face-to-face confrontation, Madison accused Smith of inefficiency and of creating discord among members of the administration. The president offered Smith the position of minister to Russia in exchange for resigning. Smith hesitated, then refused, resigned, and retired. He spent the final 30 years of his life in Baltimore. So yeah, was the original Secretary of State. They argued and right around the time of the new election coming up, he said, look, can you just, if you resign from the post of Secretary of State, I'll make you minister to Russia. And Smith was like, no. With that, we get James Monroe, who himself would become a president right after Madison. Number 5. So remember Monroe here. Born on April 28, 1758 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and died July the 4th, 1831 in New York City, New York. Was the 5th President of the United States who issued an important contribution to U.S. foreign policy in the Monroe Doctrine, which was a warning to European nations against intervening in the Western Hemisphere. The period of his administration has been called the era of good feelings. So yeah, essentially Monroe Doctrine says, look, we're the power here in the West. So North America, South America, the Caribbean, that's ours. That's within our hemisphere of power. You have that over there. And often the Monroe Doctrine has been used as a reason to try to do leadership removals in certain South and Central American countries, and invasions. All this was the Monroe Doctrine, even though it was just like, hey, don't, Europe, you need to stay the fuck out. But that was used to say, okay, so that means we can also go in because this is our land to play with. It's like, really, guys? I don't think that was what was meant. Monroe's father, Spence Monroe, was of Scottish descent, and his mother, Elizabeth Jones Monroe, of Welsh descent. The family were owners of a modest 600 acres or 240 hectares in Virginia. At the age of 16, Monroe entered the College of William and Mary, but in 1776 left to fight in the American Revolution. As a lieutenant, he crossed the Delaware with George General Washington in what became the Battle of Trenton, and suffering a near-fatal wound in the shoulder, he was carried from the field. Upon recovering, he was promoted to captain for his heroism and took part in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown. He was advanced to the rank of major and became an aide-de-camp to General William Alexander Lord Stirling, and with him shared the suffering of the troops at Valley Forge in the cruel winter of 1777 to 78. He was a scout for Washington at the Battle of Monmouth and served as Lord Stirling's adjutant general. In 1780, having resigned his commission in the army, he began to study the law under Thomas Jefferson, who was then governor of Virginia. And between the two men, there developed an intimacy and sympathy that had a powerful influence upon Monroe's later career. Jefferson had also fostered a friendship between Monroe and Madison. So yeah, strong connection and friendship between Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1782 and was chosen a member of the Governor's Council. From 1783 to 1786, he served in the Congress and under the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution of the new nation. Yeah, the first governmental document of how our government runs. The first constitution. We've talked here and there about the articles. Very state heavy over federalism, over a federal government. They did not like the idea of a centralized power. During his term, he vigorously insisted on the right of the United States to navigate the Mississippi River, then controlled by the Spanish, and attempted in 1785 to secure for the weak Congress the power to regulate commerce, thereby removing one of the great defects in the existing central government. In 1786, Monroe, then 27 years of age, and Elizabeth Courtwright of New York, 17 years of age, were married. They had two daughters, Eliza Courtwright and Maria Hester, and a son who died in infancy. Eliza was at her father's side as official hostess when he was president, substituting for her ailing mother. Maria's marriage to a cousin, Samuel L. Governor, in 1820 was the first wedding performed in the president's house, as the White House was then called. Retiring from Congress in 1786, Monroe began practicing law in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was a chosen member of the Virginia House of Delegates in 1787, and in 1788 a member of the state convention in which Virginia ratified the new federal constitution. In 1790, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he vigorously opposed President George Washington's administration. Nevertheless, in 1794, Washington nominated him as Minister to France. It was the hope of the administration that Monroe's well-known French sympathies would secure for him a favorable reception, and that his appointment would also conciliate France's friends in the United States. His warm welcome in France and his enthusiasm for the French Revolution, which he regarded as a natural successor to the American Revolution, displeased the Federalists, the party of Alexander Hamilton, which encouraged close ties not to France, but to England at home. Monroe did nothing, moreover, to reconcile the French to the Jay Treaty, which regulated commerce and navigation between the U.S. and Great Britain during the French Revolutionary Wars. Without real justification, the French regarded the treaty as a violation of the French-American Treaty of Commerce and Amity of 1778, and as a possible cause for war. Monroe led the French government to believe that the Jay Treaty would never be ratified by the U.S., that the administration of George Washington would be overthrown as a result of the obnoxious treaty, and better things would be expected after the election of 1796 of a new president, perhaps Thomas Jefferson. Washington, though he did not know of this intrigue, since that Monroe was unable to represent his government properly, and late in 1796 recalled him. Monroe returned to America in the spring of 1797, and the following December published a defense of his course in the pamphlet of 500 pages called A View on the Conduct of the Executive in the Foreign Affairs of the United States. Washington seems never to have forgiven Monroe for this stratagem, though Monroe's opinion of Washington and Jay underwent a change in his later years. In 1799, Monroe was chosen governor of Virginia and was twice elected, serving until 1802. So yeah. Clearly there was some disagreements, let's say, between Monroe and Washington. Though apparently he changed his view on how he saw them later in his life George Washington and John Jay. There was much uneasiness in the U.S. when Spain restored Louisiana to France by the Treaty of San Ildefonso in October of 1800, which was confirmed in March 1801. The Spanish district administrator's subsequent withdrawal of the United States right of deposit at New Orleans, the privilege of storing goods there for later shipment, greatly increased this feeling and led to much talk of war. Resolved to settle the matters by peaceful measures, President Jefferson in January 1803 appointed Monroe envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to France to aid Robert R. Livingston, the resident minister, in purchasing the territory at the mouth of the Mississippi, including the island of New Orleans, authorizing him at the same time to cooperate with Charles Pinckney, the minister at Madrid for Spain, in securing from Spain the cession of East and West Florida. And on April 18th, Monroe was further commissioned as the regular minister to Great Britain. So a lot of work he would have to do in Europe under the Jefferson administration. Monroe joined Livingston in Paris on April the 12th after the latter's negotiations were well underway, and the two ministers, on finding Napoleon willing to dispose of the entire province of Louisiana, decided to exceed their instructions and effect its purchase. Accordingly, on May the 2nd, 1803, they signed a treaty and two conventions antedated to April 30th, whereby France sold Louisiana to the U.S., now known as the Louisiana Purchase. The fact that Monroe signed the treaty along with Livingston did not hurt his political career at home, but he is not entitled to much credit for the diplomatic achievement. So yeah, during the time, it didn't hurt him whatsoever, though he never really got much credit for it. So while it was Jefferson as president, Monroe was one of the signees of the document that made the purchase itself, thereby doubling the size of the nation. In July of 1803, Monroe left Paris and entered upon his duties in London, and in the autumn of 1804 he proceeded to Madrid to assist Pinckney in his efforts to define the Louisiana Purchase and acquire the Floridas. After negotiating until May 1805 without success, he would return to London and resume his negotiations concerning the impressment of American seamen and the seizure of American vessels. Yeah, we talked about the impressment during the Jefferson presidency. Basically, yeah. Oh, sailors on this American vessel, you now work for the British Navy. That's essentially what it was. If you disagree, you die. Or we imprison you, whatever. As the British military was reluctant to discuss these vexing questions, little progress was made, and in May 1806, Jefferson ordered William Pinckney of Maryland to assist Monroe. The result of the deliberations was a treaty signed on December the 31st, 1806, which contained no provision against impressments and provided no indemnity for the seizure of goods or vessels. Accompanying its signature was a British reservation maintaining freedom of action to retaliate against imminent French maritime decrees. In passing over these matters, Monroe and Pinckney had disregarded their instructions, and Jefferson was so displeased with the treaty that he returned it to England for revision. He returned to the U.S. in December of 1807 and was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in the spring of 1810. In the following winter, he would again be chosen governor, serving from January to November of 1811, when he resigned and became Secretary of State under James Madison, a position he held until March of 1817. The direction of foreign affairs at the troubled period immediately preceding the War of 1812 with Great Britain thus fell upon him. On September the 27th, 1814, after the capture of Washington, D.C. by the British, he was appointed Secretary of War and discharged the duties of his office in addition to those of the Department of State until March 1815. In 1816, he was elected President of the United States as the Republican candidate, defeating Rufus King, the Federalist candidate. He received 183 electoral votes, and King 34. By 1820, when he was re-elected, receiving all the electoral votes but one, the Federalists had ceased to function as a party. So remember, they were this powerhouse because after George Washington, who didn't want to go into office saying he was a member of any party, Thomas Jefferson, or not Thomas Jefferson, oh goodness, Adams. I can't think of his, John Adams. John Adams was a member of the Federalist Party. Only president under that party's label, though perhaps not as famous as Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist. The chief events of his calm and prosperous administration, which has been called the era of good feelings, were the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, the acquisition of the Floridas from Spain, 1819 to 1821, and the Missouri Compromise in 1820, by which the first conflict over slavery under the Constitution was peacefully settled, but more or less just kicked the can down the road. Recognition of the new Latin American states, former Spanish colonies in Central and South America, and most intimately connected with Monroe's name, the enunciation in the presidential message of December the 2nd, 1823, of the Monroe Doctrine, which was profoundly influenced the foreign policy of the United States. It was not until 1848, when James K. Polk was president, did the first reference to Monroe's statement as a doctrine appear. The phrase Monroe Doctrine came into common use in the 1850s. The principles of President Monroe was a message, as the message was common referred to in Congress, consisted of 3 openly proclaimed dicta. No further European colonization in the New World. Abstention of the U.S. from political affairs of Europe, and non-intervention of Europe in the governments of the American hemisphere. Like I said, mainly it was say, you got that over there, Europe, you stay out. Stay out of North America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean. So when it was first introduced, it was like, it wasn't that bad of a thought. But we know it's been since used to say we are thus the superpower here, so we must do the intervening when necessary. And yeah, it's kind of what it's been turned into. In the diplomatic correspondence preceding the proclamation of these principles in the President's message was a 4th dictum, not publicly associated with the doctrine until 1869. The U.S. opposed the transfer of any existing European colonies from one European sovereign to another. If Europe already had a colony in the Americas, they couldn't just say, okay, this colony goes from this European nation to this European nation. Though it's not listed, it is something that is considered part of it. Because it was before the actual doctrine itself. It is generally concluded that the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, was the sole author of the non-colonization principle of the doctrine. The principle of abstention from European wars and politics was common to all the fathers of American independence, inherited and expressed by the younger Adams all his professional life in cabinet meetings. Adams also urged the dictum of non-intervention in the affairs of nations of the Western Hemisphere. But Adams had no idea of proclaiming these dicta to the world. Monroe took responsibility for embodying them in a presidential message that he drafted himself. Modern historical judgment considers the Monroe Doctrine to be appropriately named. So Quincy Adams kind of was the main idealist and author of it, but Monroe was like, I like these principles, they're good, let's put these forth. President Monroe and his wife remained smitten by France after their sojourn there, and their daughters, and with their daughters, often spoke French together when they were in the White House. Elizabeth Monroe clothed herself in Paris creations and insisted on French etiquette and French cuisine at her table. Given the opportunity to refurnish the executive mansion when it was rebuilt after the destruction of 1814, the Monroes spent lavishly on gilded furniture, silverware, and various objets d'art imported from France. Some items that the president had purchased from impoverished French noble families While he was minister, he now lent or sold to the government for use in the executive mansion at prices some considered suspiciously high, though Monroe was later cleared of impropriety. The First Lady, who was always in fragile health, suffered from an unidentified malady. She was often away from Washington for months at a time visiting her married daughters. To the considerable irritation of the Washington Society, she discontinued Dolly Madison's practice of paying courtesy calls on Washington hostesses. Still, Elizabeth Monroe was not without ardor. Shortly after her arrival in France during the Reign of Terror, she helped to rescue Madame Lafayette, wife of Marquis de Lafayette, from prison and perhaps saved her from the guillotine. On the expiration of his second term, Monroe retired to his home in a state called Oak Hill in Northern Virginia, and in 1826 he became a regent of the University of Virginia, and in 1829 was a member of the convention called to amend the state constitution. Having neglected his private affairs and incurred large expenditures during his missions to Europe and his presidency, he was deeply in debt and felt compelled to ask Congress to reimburse him. In 1826, Congress finally authorized the payment to him of $30,000, almost immediately adding additional claims. He went back to Congress seeking more money. Congress paid him another $30,000 in 1831, but he still did not feel satisfied. After his death, Congress appropriated a small amount for the purchase of his papers from his heirs. Monroe would die in 1831, like Jefferson and Adams before him, on the 4th of July in New York City at the home of daughter Maria, with whom he was living after the death of his wife the year before. In 1858, the centennial year of his birth, his remains were interred with impressive ceremonies at Richmond, Virginia. After Liberia was created in 1821 as a haven for freed slaves, and its capital city was named Monrovia in honor of the American president who had supported the repatriation of black people to Africa. Jefferson, Madison, and Quincy Adams and many other prominent statesmen of Monroe's time all spoke loudly in his praise, but he suffers by comparison with the greater men of his time. Possessing none of their brilliance, he had nonetheless, to use the words of John Quincy Adams, a mind sound in its ultimate judgments and firm in its final conclusions. Some of Monroe's popularity undoubtedly stemmed from the fact that he was the last of the Revolutionary War generation, and he reminded people of those heady times when the struggle for independence was in the balance. Tall and stately in appearance, he still wore the knee breeches, silk stockings, and cocked hat of those days, and many of his admirers said he resembled George Washington. So yeah, Monroe's was much longer here. I also have another article, but I won't get into reading it. It's from the White House Historical Society on Monroe. But yeah. So, that has been a look at the Vice Presidents and Secretary of States for the Madison presidency. all four of them would have significant impact on the American infancy. Founding fathers of tremendous importance. But this one has been a long ass video. And with that said, I'll end it here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources, and it can't be tinfoil hat wearing sources or a bunch of anecdotes slapped together to try to make a source. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.